Tackling mental health. A series of recent attacks around the world have once again brought the issue to the forefront. Is there a link between violence and mental health? What are governments doing to deal with it? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. This year has seen a series of so-called lone wolf attacks which have killed hundreds of people around the world. Some have been linked to the very kind of violent ideology promoted by ISIL, but others have not. From Orlando to Nice to Munich, relatives of some of the attackers have come forward and talked about a history of mental illness. The role of mental health is often missing in the discussion about the possible motives for these mass killings. And that's something we want to explore on today's Inside Story. First, Step Vassen has this report from the Netherlands, where there's been a recent increase in the number of criminal incidents involving mentally ill people.
Flowers are the only reminder of an incident that shocked the small town of Bennekom a few weeks ago. 51-year-old Erna Vechter set herself on fire in the middle of town. She was mentally ill and had asked help from a student the day before.
She told me she could not handle her situation alone. Things would go wrong if she would not receive help. She said she needed to return to the mental institution, the Riedhorst.
After he called police, the woman was brought back home.
This is where Erna has set herself on fire, and many watched her do it, including children. They're now receiving counseling. Before her dramatic death, the 51-year-old wrote this poem online. I earn a silver medal for all I have gone through with mental health care. The point is, sadly enough, they don't listen. I will do anything to wake up mental health care.
Erna's death is one of tens of thousands of incidents in the Netherlands every year. The murder of a former government health minister by a schizophrenic man shocked the Dutch 2 years ago. Experts say mental health care has been squeezed by government cuts.
So institutions now, they suffer with the fact that these difficult to treat patients, chronic patients, they are very costly, and because of the system, lots of these institutions do not want to treat them.
More and more chronically ill patients are forced to live on the streets, where they are often arrested. To deal with the growing numbers, in The Hague, a psychiatric center has been built inside a police station. The Minister of Health declined our request for an interview, but a leader of a government team formed to deal with incidents blames a lack of cooperation between institutions. She says budget cuts should not be used as an excuse.
The awareness of those mentally ill people, to put them on the political agenda, to improve the cooperation between all these authorities, will diminish the risks. And that's what we are fighting for. That's why we are working so hard.
The government team is hoping for a fall in the number of incidents by the end of the year. So a cry for help, like Erna's, here on the phone with police the day before her death,
omdat ik mij wil laten helpen, maar
won't be ignored in the future. Step Vassen, Al Jazeera, Bennekom, the Netherlands.
Let's get the thoughts of our guests now then. Joining us in London, Raj Persaud. He's a consultant psychiatrist and a professor at London's Gresham College. In Accra, joining us on Skype, we have Peter Yaro, Executive Director of Basic Needs Ghana. Welcome to you both. If I could start with Raj, is there any correlation at all between violent attacks and mental health problems?
As a consultant psychiatrist, I have worked in the past in forensic, secure psychiatric units. So I've dealt directly with people who've been charged and who've been prosecuted for serious violent crimes and who've suffered a mental illness. It is certainly the case that some kinds of mental illness, and it looks as though from the preliminary findings that the attack in Japan appears to have been conducted by a young man who looks like he was suffering from a paranoid psychotic illness. It is certainly the case that some mental illnesses, some extreme psychotic illnesses where you're in the grip of a delusion, for example, can be linked to violence. But I think a mistake is being made by the media with this cluster of attacks that's occurring at the moment, and they're all being lumped together. I think actually, in many cases, they're occurring for very different reasons. For example, the attack in France on the priest was conducted by two people, and I suspect there's an organizational element and a political element to that. But some of the attacks that have been conducted by lone individuals, I suspect that mental illness and psychiatric disorder plays quite a significant role in those attacks. But I think each attack has to be considered specifically.
Well, that's a good point, Peter. Perhaps we should point out, Peter, that what we're discussing today should not in any way be taken to as a conclusion that anyone with mental health issues necessarily or even likely will turn into some kind of violent mass killer. Correct, Peter?
There is no link 100% that because he has a mental problem or she has a mental problem will become a violent mass killer. However, it's worth noting, and I entirely agree with the consultant psychiatrist, that by the time somebody is acting violently, he will not have had all his mental faculties in the best of frames. So something would have triggered the person who even normally going through assessment may not be found to have a psychiatric problem, but by the time whatever violent act is being perpetrated at that stage, he could have passed to have been at a certain level that if help was provided, it could have probably averted what the person has done.
Okay, that's an interesting way. Perhaps if, Raj, if we were to perhaps reverse the assumption here, not everybody with mental health issues is going to be violent, and if they are, they're not necessarily going to be violent to others, and they're even perhaps less likely to be violent to masses. But having said that, there does seem to be some research that says that some types of mass violent killers you do find a recurring sort of common denominator that they have mental health issues. I point to one, Paul Gill, the University College of London, did a study, found a higher rate of mental health issues among so-called lone wolf attackers as opposed to people involved in the sorts of terrorist networks you were talking about. Can we at least draw that sort of correlation?
To understand the role of psychiatric disorder in this kind of attack, you've got to understand, first of all, that there are two kinds of situations you are considering when you're dealing with a mass killing or a murderous rampage where lots of people are killed in one geographical location over a short period of time. If you look at a terrorist organization that might perpetrate an attack like that, an organization is a group of people who have to work together and obey rules and coordinate with each other and communicate with each other in a coherent manner and have to plan together. Interestingly enough, even if you find the ideology of many terrorist organizations reprehensible, the evidence so far is that most members of such an organization, while you may not like their point of view or think of them as abhorrent, they're not suffering from serious mental illnesses or mental illnesses in general. Indeed, the research indicates they're surprisingly, perhaps, psychologically healthy. And if you think about the fact that for an organization to be effective, it has to have people who will follow orders, who will understand them, and who will obey them. And that tends to rule out most major serious psychiatric disorder, which tends to be linked with a chaotic way of being. So oddly enough, terrorist organizations, not only do they not want people who suffer from mental illnesses, they want people who have good mental health, who will be effective operatives. So oddly enough, they screen out people with serious psychiatric disorder. And that's quite an important point, because I think there's a conflation in most people's minds that when someone commits a horrendous act that seems beyond comprehension, an evil act, if we can use that word, there's an automatic link in the public's mind that that must mean that person is mad. But psychiatrists would not use the term in that way.
Right,
so terrorist organizations
Raj,
or people who are part of it tend not to be suffering from a serious mental illness.
Right, but Raj, that may be the case when it comes to people involved in a more sort of organizational structures. But maybe this is anecdotal, but some of the lone wolf attacks, that does seem, I mean, is there evidence that does seem to suggest that that's different. The prosecutors in the case of the July 22nd shooting in Munich said the suspect was suffering from mental illness and had received psychiatric treatment in the months before the shooting. The ex-wife of Omar Mateen described him as mentally ill after that attack on a gay nightclub in Orlando in the USA. The relatives of Mohammed Bouhlel said he was prescribed on antipsychotic medication after the Bastille Day attacks in Nice, France, and the list goes on. The 2014 Lint Cafe attacker in Australia, Man Haron Monis, was reported to have some kind of criminal and mental health issue history. I mean, when it comes to these sorts of lone wolf attacks, who often get scooped up in the sort of picture of what's called a terrorism attack, is there not a common denominator of mental health issues there?
Well, I agree with you completely. What I was trying to do, and I was going to go on to talk about lone wolf attacks, was draw a distinction that in fact the research evidence is lone wolf individuals who perpetrate these kinds of attacks are psychologically indeed very different from the members of terrorist organizations. And again, I think the media is lumping these two things together because they're seeing a common denominator, which is a lot of people dead, but actually the pathway by which people end up in that situation are very different. Lone wolf individuals clearly have a much higher rate of psychiatric disorder than members of terrorist organizations. It's a completely different psychological phenomenon. And the pattern you tend to see with a lone wolf individual is someone who has a long history of some kind of psychiatric disorder. And throughout their lives, often they have been dysfunctional in one way or the other. So they tend to end up being loners. They have very few friends. They usually have divorced or a breakdown in intimate relationships or unable to find them. And as they spiral downwards through their lives, as they fail and fail again, they begin to harbor resentment and hatred against society at large. So in a homicide, you hate an individual and you then kill that individual. These people hate a community and they hate a society. And they blame that society or that community for their problems. And as a result, they take revenge. And that's the psychology of the lone wolf killer. Right. The really interesting thing as well is the geographic location of where the killing occurs gives a clue as to who they're resentful towards. So the Munich killer, for example, picked a shopping mall where lots of young people attend. And apparently the evidence is this was a young person who was bullied. Perhaps their resentment was towards young people, hence they were targeted. In America, many employees who've been given the sack and who return to work to shoot everyone at work and then kill themselves harbor resentment towards the workplace, the boss, their fellow employees. So if you harbor resentment towards a society at large or a particular community, the psychological clue lies partly in where the attack occurs.
All right, let's look at things from the perspective of what Peter has discovered in your research. Often, perhaps in the West, in the Middle East, there's been a tendency to try and interpret any act of mass killing in terms of some kind of extreme ideology, religious, far right, and so on. But in your experience, Peter, in dealing with instances of mass or multiple killings, which seem to have involved some kind of mental health issues, what has been the common denominator, if any, in terms of ideology?
To a large extent, well, but let me just say that mentally ill people have had enough stigma that we should add another type of label to them, that once they are mentally ill, they are violent. But it's also the case that for most people who have had mental illness and have not been able to deal with it, some of the fallouts are violent acts. In our experience in Ghana, we have had documented incidents of people who, out of having a very serious mental problem, have ended up acting in ways that have hurt not just themselves in terms of suicide, but have also hurt their immediate family and relations. Most of it would come from people using religion, for which they think that I have heard that I'm not successful because of what you have done to me, as we have heard in a recent incident in Ghana involving a policeman who you would have said that has had all the endurance to endure pain, to endure psychological torture in the rest, but who could not stand it and have had to kill the wife, the children, a mother-in-law, probably sparing the wife because she was not at home, because for a long time she was behaving abnormally, very lowly, will not sleep, and kept accusing everybody for misfortunes. There are also incidents of a brother who has had a mental problem. They went to farm and he murdered this brother. It would suppose that if it was not for the mental illness, probably that would not have happened. If he could have had his own internal mechanisms to have that resilience to deal with such a problem, maybe he wouldn't go over the brink.
I think the point which Peter is making there is very clear, that while mental health challenges or problems don't necessarily mean that you're going to be a violent person, but it does seem that in some cases of people who have done mass violent attacks, mental health is some kind of recurring factor. Raj, what I'm wondering is it possible to take this sort of analysis one step further and say that perhaps this should be a parameter when trying to identify or build a profile of a mass killer? And the reason I'm asking about this is the Australian Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, now is asking the head of the counter-terrorism agency to investigate whether lone wolf attackers can be identified by looking at three factors: extremism, criminality, and mental illness. Is it possible to put mental illness in that sort of identikit parameter that you attempt to use to identify who might be the next mass killer?
Well, clearly what's happening in Australia is happening all over the world, that security services are very, very concerned about lone wolf attacks. And the evidence is that as a proportion of victims killed over recent years, that proportion of victims that have been killed by lone wolf attacks is going up. So in other words, lone wolf attacks as a proportion of overall victims of terrorism in general are going up. So counter-terrorist agencies are much more successful against terrorist organizations. And the reason for that is they can intercept communications between people in a terrorist organization, or they can infiltrate it. The very fact you're dealing with a community of people makes them vulnerable to infiltration and interception by security services. Security services, and governments don't like to admit this to the public, are really finding it very difficult to prevent lone wolf attacks, precisely because the normal techniques and methodologies security services use are useless against a lone wolf individual, because that lone wolf individual hasn't got other people to communicate with. In other words, you'd have to try and get inside their heads in order to figure out what's going on. And in a way, that's what the Australian authorities are hinting at. Can we get inside the head of the mass killer and prevent it before it happens? Well, again, the research on this is very interesting. There are some classic patterns. And one of the things you do see is that mass killings tend to be suicidal acts. And one of the terms that's been used in the psychiatric literature is that these are a kind of extended suicide. So by the time someone decides to perform the act, they often, not always, but often are suicidal. And often you see an incident of humiliation has occurred recently that's pushed them over the edge into the realm of feeling suicidal. They decide to take out a lot of people with them, as well as going themselves. And in some of the recent incidents, I suspect you will find, when you look back into the past of the individuals, the lone wolf attacks, who were suffering from a mental illness, is you'll see a gradual deterioration in their psychiatric health and a triggering incident. But again, the problem the authorities are going to have is the vast majority of the mentally ill are not dangerous. However, very, very dangerous people who commit mass killings, a large proportion of those do have a background of psychiatric disorder.
All right, so if we look at it from that perspective, if somebody perhaps is already flagged up for, I don't know, visiting extreme ideology websites, whether it's religious or political or far right, and they've perhaps got some kind of background in criminality, criminal offences, and some indications, you know, that they've been on the meds, some mental health issues. I'm wondering, Peter, because you've worked with people and you made this statement that, you know, if some of these attackers or mass killers had some help, perhaps they wouldn't have did what they've done. What is it that authorities can do? What's the next step if they, you know, if they identify that this person looks like he's on the edge? What is it that authorities should do or can do that they're not doing, Peter?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, we've all talked about social networks. If somebody would spend hours on the internet and not talking to any other person. If somebody would remain in the room for probably the whole of the day and only comes out probably a few hours and goes back, and no one is concerned, then there is an issue there. And where we are becoming more and more individualistic, just as Raj have said, the loner is the person that no intelligence can get inside him to know what's happening. It is the networks that we have around that give assurance, that give comfort, that says, I am here, there is a shoulder here for you to cry on, I'm here for you to confide in whatever issues you have, to the extent that you would not vent your anger that for this kind of humiliation, I would die by the extended suicide explanation given. I would die, but first I have to kill more before I finally die. So that is where governments have to come in, to say that there are people who are vulnerable and that we should find all ways to help them to live those positive lives, that we aren't all that resilient, all that strong.
But practically speaking, Peter, when you say they should do more, what can authorities do?
Authorities should make it possible for professionals to be widely available. We should make sure that our communities are friendly communities. We have all the networks that people can, even places for socialization should be improved. In Ghana, it's a situation where even public parks are gradually being taken over by buildings. There are no social amusement areas, or they are either expensive for people. So starting from school recreational activities, issues of helping people exercise, let children be together, let them be interested in library and the rest. Right. Let family members who were extended, who were neighborly, be interested in others by ensuring that wherever there is need for a social worker, the person is there. The pressures of life are also recognized by government, and right. People who need the support in terms of treatment actually get it. This is the problem that we right. are not getting in Ghana, where medicines, professionals, infrastructure is still very basic.
Okay, we've got about a minute and a half left, so let me come back to Raj. This clearly sounds like a very difficult issue, because we're talking about parameters which are quite broad. I mean, we talk about people, Peter was mentioning, you know, we should look out for people perhaps who are spending too much time alone on the internet or computer. Well, I might be slightly oversimplifying it, but I'm sure you get my point. There's probably a lot of parents who would be worrying about their teenagers spending a lot of time on the computer. At what stage do you take it from a sort of parental concern to a national security concern? You've got to really, as you said, be inside the head of people. And that's a difficult challenge for any government that believes in a free society, surely.
I actually believe the problem is not that difficult to solve, but the reality is it's embedded in the structure of our societies. You think about the funding for cancer healthcare or cardiac healthcare in every society around the world. These are things that are seen as very necessary to correctly fund. In any health service around the world, these are things that are given priorities. Mental health is not given a priority in any society around the world. Even in the USA and in the UK, where I'm speaking to you from, the mental health services are vastly underfunded in comparison to cardiac services or cancer services. What needs to happen is they just need to be properly funded, and also the correct expertise needs to be in play. Over and over again, you see that many of these mass killers made contact with psychiatric services, but didn't make contact again because the services were so underfunded, they didn't perform any follow-up and track these people down and invite them to come back to appointments, or they were discharged early from a psychiatric hospital because the services are just too thin on the ground. So that's point number one. Better funding of services would make a difference. Point number two, there are often some clear signals. In every single assassination of a major public figure in the Western world in the last 50 years, conducted by a lone wolf individual, that lone wolf individual has made contact before. They sent a letter in before. And that's usually a marker of a threat. And there's a thing called the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre here in the UK that screens out crank mail to identify potential threats. So there are markers that would signal the mentally ill who might be dangerous.
Yeah. I'm afraid we are out of time, so we're going to have to thank our guests, Raj Persaud and Peter Yaro. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website aljazeera.com, or for further discussion head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now is goodbye.